I am going to take just a minute here to introduce you to the three people that are responsible for creating this toolkit and putting a lot of work and thought into what would be useful. One of our colleagues, Wayne Martino, is one of the authors of this project. Wayne is a professor of equity and social justice in the Faculty of Education and an affiliate faculty member in the Department of Gender Studies, Sexuality and Women's Studies at Western University. He coordinates and teaches in the Master of Professional Education and Doctor of Education programs in Equity, Diversity, and Social Justice. And he is currently the principal investigator on a recently funded SSHRC project, Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, for those of you who aren't aware of our acronyms. It's a research study entitled Supporting Transgender Students and Transgender Affirmative Education in a Context of Resurgent Anti-Trans Backlash and Far-Right Extremism. So we look forward to the results of that project coming in. Kenan Omercajic is currently the Strategic Business Analyst for the Ottawa-Carleton District School Board after serving as the Policy Analyst for the board. Prior to this, he was a doctoral student here at Western, hello Kenan, where his research focused on trans-affirmative policies and how all gender bathrooms were written into these policies. He examined how all gender bathrooms were used by students in schools and how these spaces were viewed by students, teachers, and administrators. And last but not least is our own Jenny Kassen. Jenny is a PhD candidate at the Faculty of Education here at Western, and their research focuses on the provision of and access to mental health supports for trans and gender diverse students in Ontario secondary schools. In addition, they are the instructor for the 2S LGBTQIA+ studies in education at Western's teacher education program. They are a secondary school teacher focusing on alternative education and an educational consultant. And they have neglected to also mention that they are responsible for coordinating our Master Teacher Mentor program and have been instrumental in supporting the teacher candidates here at this faculty in many, many different ways. So thank you very much to the three who are going to lead you through this launch of this really exciting and important toolkit. Jenny.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Kathy, for introducing us. And thank you to everybody who is in person here with us today and joining us through Zoom. We're so excited to share with you this toolkit, Trans-Affirming Education, let's try that again. Trans-Affirming Education in Schools and Educator Toolkit. So through Zoom, we are connected in all kinds of really wonderful ways to the territory that we're on from coast to coast today. And our team specifically is located across a number of different territories. So Kenan is in the city of Ottawa, and he's on unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation. Wayne is located in the city of Toronto on the traditional territories of the Mississauga, the Anishinaabe, Chippewa, Haudenosaunee, and Wendat peoples. And here in London, we are on the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lenape-Wack, and Chinookic peoples. Naming the impacts of colonialism, historical and ongoing, is particularly important when we're having discussions around sexuality and gender, because the binaries in which these concepts are currently understood are colonial constructs. And locally and globally, Indigenous communities have always recognized and affirmed the existence of the full diversity and range of the human experience of sexuality and gender. And this has been going on since time immemorial. And this action, these understandings were really at the forefront of what we were doing when we were developing this toolkit and making sure that we were embedding these understandings within the resource that we were producing. So for today, what we have is we'd love to share with you a little bit about the story, or the study rather, that was the inspiration for this toolkit. To share with you an overview of the process that we went through in creating the toolkit itself, to provide you with a snapshot of each of the modules that are provided within the toolkit itself, and then spend a little bit of time on questions and answers, if there are any of those. So I will turn it over now.
Hello, everyone. I'm just going to talk a little bit about the study that is at the heart of this toolkit, and the research that we did as part of that study, which was really, really significant for us. So the next slide there. Okay, yeah, so it was a part of an international study funded by SSHRC, and the whole purpose behind the study was to and this study really was funded some years ago when you think about this. So it was 2015 where we started this study. So we were wanting to find out more about trans-affirmative policies and also the education that was going on at the time, particularly in light of a number of policies and guidelines that were being produced by a number of school boards, but one in particular that really came to influence us. And in developing, the instrument of the survey, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a minute, we did consult with a range of people and a range of community partners, and there are a number of meetings. And in fact, the idea for the survey came from one of those partners. It wasn't actually built into our thinking about the study in terms of how we had formulated it at the start. So, so those members included, school board members, consultants, educators, counsellors, people from community organisations, and trans and non-binary people, and their experience and their voices were at the centre of these consultations. And there's just an image of the report on the right there. So I wanted just to talk a little bit about the survey. It took a long time to develop. There were lots of conversations in the development of it. The questions specifically focused on, we wanted to learn, for instance, or ask educators about, what knowledge did they have of policy? How likely were they, if they did have knowledge, how likely were they to follow the policy? To what extent did they feel there was support for a trans inclusive and affirming policy in their schools? And also we asked educators to rate their knowledge and understanding of trans inclusion and gender diversity. We also asked them about any specific training and professional development that they had received and where they received that training. We asked them to talk to us or to provide us with their knowledge of resources or their thoughts about provision of resources. And then finally in the survey, we were wanting to learn more about the challenges and barriers as they were identified by the educators themselves. And finally, we did ask for recommendations. So there were quantitative items, but there was also space in the survey for educators to elaborate and to provide, qualitative and written responses. And in fact, those responses, we spent many, many days, many hours that spilled over into over a year, actually, of constantly returning, to those comments, to code them and to capture, I think, the essence of what educators were telling us about their experiences, both with the policy, their experiences with support, their identification of the challenges and the recommendations. But I just want to stress that that was a very protracted process, just because the amount of data that we did get, there was over 1,000 people who completed the survey. The survey was distributed through social media. We had great support, and Jenny played a leading role in this through OSSTF, and the unions were very supportive in sending out this research to educators. And so, we had a lot of data and a lot of voices that we were listening to, and we wanted to do justice to capturing the insights and the perspectives of educators who took time to complete the survey for us. As you will see with the regions there, it was quite expansive across different parts of Ontario, you know, the central, the west, and you can see the breakdown of the participants there. So, you know, central, west, east, north. And so we were happy about the nature of that representation. And I just want to say this, I know Kenan will be moving shortly to talk about the findings, but I just wanted to say that there was consistency across boards and across regions, actually, in terms of the findings that Kenan's going to talk about. So I don't want to encroach upon that right now, but I just wanted to mention that because I think it's really significant. And also in terms of, you know, the position of, you know, the positions that educators held. There was a range of them as well. A significant number of elementary and secondary teachers, which we were happy about, but also occasional, a number of support staff. There was a small number of administrative, librarian, and just a small number of teacher candidates. I also, before we go on to the findings, want to acknowledge Dr. Lynn Dare. She's in the audience. Hi, Lynn. Lynn was instrumental to supporting us throughout COVID, when we started to really continue into analysing the data. And Lynn was such an amazing support for us. And in fact, the leadership that she provided and the leadership of Kenan and Jenny, who were RAs on the project, I want to acknowledge we're a team, we worked together, and without them, we wouldn't have been able to produce this report or the toolkit that came from it, which was in fact Jenny's idea, and it's so wonderful to see it come to fruition today. So I'm going to hand it over to you now, Kenan.
Thanks, Wayne. Hi, everyone. So next, we're just going to cover the findings that emerged from our study, and it's really the experiences and the insights from the educators in our report that served as a catalyst for the toolkit that really got Jenny, as Wayne said, ruminating on, well, all of this is emerging from our educators. What can we give them as a result of these experiences? And so we're just going to talk a bit about what emerged in the report that you can find online. So what emerged in our report wasn't necessarily surprising in the sense that what was being indicated, because it's been covered by scholars regularly for years, and it's just shown that as time has gone on, things have not necessarily resolved, and these issues are still emergent in the system. But what our report signaled was how pervasive these gaps continue to be within the education system. And as Wayne said, not just particular to one board or another, it was across the province. And so what became abundantly very clear across the province was this complete lack of education or professional development that was being provided about transgender and gender diverse people, or rather not being provided, where 75% of our educational workers said that they received little to none of this education. And in light of this complete lack of education, nearly half of our sample indicated that a helpful approach moving forward would be professional development, with some going so far as to suggest that this PD should be deemed mandatory, largely because often this PD isn't mandatory and it's taken up by folks who are already interested or actively doing the work, and it's not necessarily those individuals who need the PD. And so that's the rationale behind the mandatory piece. And just as importantly, and linked to this education piece, was a lack of resources as a significant barrier to supporting trans and gender diverse students, with 44% of our sample indicating that to be a significant issue. And within our report, you'll also find a section dedicated to trans educational workers, which we have a slide coming up that'll explore that a little more in terms of those perspectives. But one of those workers indicated that they weren't even entirely aware how to infuse trans-affirmative education into their classroom, which one noted, and I quote, "I was not sure how to incorporate the subject in my classroom in a way that would not offend students and parents." So it's not just about resources, but ensuring that resources are available in a way that suit the needs of the particular educator and also the ecosystem of their classroom in a way that they can disseminate it in a way that makes sense for them. Next, we're just going to touch on some of the systemic issues that were emerging through our findings, in the sense that while policy was indicated as important in our report, they were also noted as not necessarily being enough. You see in the first box here, I don't think that the policies really look at the barriers which trans folks face. The policies are not about uncovering and challenging biases. So this is speaking to larger systemic issues that policies can't necessarily tackle. They're important, but they can't really excavate those systemic issues on their own. And even one trans educational worker even noted that we need to have direct policy, but also resources found at the school board to support positive, inclusive hiring practices for transgender teachers, getting at that representation piece as well to start doing that work. So in addition, while educational workers are intentional about trans-affirming education, there's also the specter of the angry parent that looms large. So for example, in the second box, you had one individual saying, my admin is somewhat supportive, but afraid of parental backlash. I think a lot of their steps forward, though, are due to my presence as an out queer teacher. So really, it's this one individual's presence as an out educator that's really driving the work, and it's falling on that one individual to do that work. One educator, however, can't be the only one doing it. Schools are pretty big ecosystems, and on top of the systemic issues at play, there's the nefarious bullying that students endure. So you see it here in this third box. One educator noted that bullies are facing no real consequences. So it's important that there's a whole school approach and a whole system approach that ensures bullying, transphobia, and homophobia are confronted, challenged, and not tolerated. Suffice it to say, these are examples of ways in which transphobia manifests. And it's also important to understand that transphobia is not isolated to one board and not one specific way of happening. So oftentimes it starts with projecting what you consider important onto youth. So in particular, a number of our respondents indicated that they teach in elementary grades, and therefore their students were too young to understand or engage with gender, yet failed to acknowledge the importance of providing students with information to sift through the conflicting and misleading messages they hear about gender, sexual orientation on top of that, and to provide them with a context to really develop positive attitudes and respectful values based on accurate information about gender that can also benefit their understanding of themselves. So I'd like to flag that point because I'll take up that a little bit later. Then there's also the piece that many educators are trying to do trans-affirming or inclusive work in Catholic schools, and we can't discount that presence in schools, but they're often facing pushback or silencing mechanisms embedded within Catholic school systems. So in particular, respondents from Catholic schools were explicit about the lack of support. They highlighted tension between Catholic doctrine and provision of support for trans students in their schools. So this type of transphobia often emerged through narrow interpretations of the Catholic faith and pastoral care, which resulted in paying lip service to supporting human rights as a broad idea for all students without providing any really specific support for trans students or committing to educating about gender diversity and really turning the other cheek to that fundamental human right. And finally, another form of transphobia that emerges and that we're seeing emerge quite a bit at this juncture in time. So I can only imagine that what we heard in this report about this would skyrocket at this point, is that it's this dichotomy of parental backlash and religious belief in a kind of competing rights discourse that justifies transphobic rhetoric through religious rights. So religious rights are positioned as a transphobic mechanism to excuse explicit or implicit harm as a result of religious belief and religious right. But I want to stress, and it's important to note here, that this is actually settled law in Canada, that learning about gender identity, gender expression, and sexual orientation in school, even if it conflicts with religious beliefs, does not interfere with a person's right to hold those religious beliefs or practices. It actually creates what the Supreme Court of Canada described as cognitive dissonance, which teaches children to be tolerant in a diverse society. And so this is settled in Canadian law. So as I mentioned previously about flagging a comment, that emerges here. So where we had trans educators specifically identify transphobia and a lack of knowledge as major challenges that we need to overcome, especially in how the lack of knowledge impacted their own embodied identities and how they understood themselves. Sometimes not until much later in life, as you see in the first box here, where the individual says, I'm a trans woman who may very well have realized it sooner than 38 years old if there had been supports in place for me to realize that identity. That would have changed my life to a significant degree. And so this is why it's important that to challenge the too young discourse, because it's important for folks to understand the capacities to identify and to have them equipped with that knowledge as they navigate further through life. So this kind of situation doesn't happen. Much of this knowledge and work to disseminate knowledge is coming from folks within the community rather than outside of it. So one trans educator noted that they largely relied on their own personal experience in order to advocate for themselves and for their students. And it really should not be on one individual, let alone one individual in the community who has a stake in the fight, to be doing all this work on their own. So there's need for support across the entire school rather than just one educator, which is often what's happening. As I mentioned, we need a whole school approach, which is what we're trying to deliver in this toolkit as well as capacity to integrate that. This means that administration is supportive and all staff are trans-informed in their pedagogy and philosophy. So this links back to one of the previous slides where I mentioned that one teacher can't be the one doing the education, stopping the bullying, informing others of the policies, extending internal and external resources, relying on their community networks to help facilitate education, starting and running a GSA, on top of just doing regular teacher duties. It's too much, it's unrealistic. And so, and it's also not how pervasive systemic change is effectuated. So it's important that we're not loading this on one educator. And now we introduce our toolkit to you folks.
Thanks, Kevin. So while we were immersed in going through this report and reading through the experiences and hearing directly from educators, I just want to do a side note here to say that when we use the term educators, we are talking about all educational workers within the school. As you saw from the sample, it was not just teachers that we heard from. And what's really important here is that we recognize that it is not just teachers who work in schools, that there are so many people who contribute to these learning communities. And so we're hearing from all of these experiences, and we had an opportunity to pause and reflect on what our opportunities here were for knowledge mobilization with this report. Because while we're hearing from these experiences, what we were also hearing very, very loudly was that people had some very specific needs that they were expressing to us. Can we go to the next one, please, Kenan? Thank you. So we learned two really, really important lessons here. The first one was that there was a real need for education about trans-affirming policies in schools because people were aware that they existed, but they didn't know the specifics and the details. And that this was really critical to them being able to then implement those policies in their work. And the second thing that we learned was that staff, we were very ready and willing to do this work, but they were requesting support because they did not feel like they could do it on their own. And so what emerged from this was a toolkit, a companion piece to the actual report that responded to the needs that were being requested from us through this survey. The needs were really around increasing knowledge of rainbow identities and facilitating a practical connection between theory and practice in work in educational settings. And what was really, really important to the whole team was that we not just create a report that would provide information about what was happening, but that we also provide something very, very concrete that addressed the needs that were identified by participants to address the education that they were requesting, the resources that they were requesting, and the support that they were requesting. So when we're looking at the content that we would include in this toolkit, we leaned on these participant identified topics to guide what we included. We came up with 5 modules that addressed foundational knowledge of rainbow identities, accessible summaries of theoretical frameworks, key theoretical approaches to doing this work, frameworks of conceptualizing schools as affirming as opposed to inclusive spaces, a focus on policy, and strategic action plans to help maneuver and put into action these learnings that were taking place. And while there are very specific references to curriculum, because this was something that participants requested directly from us, we did ensure deliberately that these resources that are included and the frameworks that are included, that every single piece of this is applicable to all educational workers at large within a school community. And this work is required because we need a whole school approach in order to make this happen. We also looked at the modules as being flexible. So you can work through these sequentially, but you also have the option to pick and choose. If you want to start directly with the action plans, you can do that. We recognize that folks working in schools are stretched to capacity. And so having the ability to move between modules is a really important thing for them to do to meet them where they're at in terms of their learning. The resources that we've included in the toolkit are embedded live links. So educators can just go through and they are dispersed throughout each module. There are opportunities to link to different resources within the document. And they span a very, very wide range of topics and are applicable to, again, a very wide range of age levels, because as Kenan was mentioning, this is absolutely critical that students, inclusive of age, inclusive of subject matter, be exposed to these topics. We also had, while we were working with the visual layout of this document and of the report, the opportunity to work with a phenomenal group of individuals who work out of Toronto called The Public. And so The Public described themselves as an activist studio specializing in changing the world. And this might seem very, very broad, but I truly believe that this is what they are doing, because they focus on social justice programs. They focus on using their skills to make anti-oppression work accessible to people. They focus on sustainability. They focus on social growth. And they use their skills as designers to leverage really important messaging in a way that is approachable, accessible, and working with them was a game changer. What we were able to do with them was create intentional moments of reflexivity throughout this entire toolkit. Things like small check-ins, so that learning doesn't have to be reading entire academic articles about things, but can be bite-sized. It can be fun. It can be something that is enjoyable for people working through this. They worked with us to make sure that there was space that invited the reader to be interactive with this toolkit. And for me, one of the most important things was the 2 visual themes that they developed for us. So if you think back to the slides that you've seen that featured the cover of the report, the visual theme that they developed there was a tearing away, a revealing of something underneath, which is what we're doing through this study. We're tearing away at the illusion of inclusivity that exists in Ontario schools right now, and revealing the reality that was behind it through the experience of educators across Ontario. The title and the visual theme that goes through the toolkit is a contrast to that, in that it is about building things up. And you'll notice the visual theme is of constructing and of pasting things together. So on one hand, we have the revelation. On the other hand, we're inviting the readers to be collaborators in this work with us. So we are going to go through the modules now, and we're each going to tell you a little bit about what you're going to find in this toolkit.
I'll just talk a little bit about the first module, but just want to reiterate Jenny's point about the public, I mean, such a privilege to work with them, and how we were able to extend, the translation of the research in this way. And even when you look at it visually, it was very impactful. And just want to remind you, as Jenny's reiterated, of the 3 prongs. It was knowledge, resource, support. They were the things uppermost in our mind. And actually, as we were developing the modules, which took place over a protracted period of time, actually, the toolkit was only finalized with the public last week, right, Jenny and Kenan? It was last week? Yeah, so we're hitting, we were at this for a long time because I know you can never get it totally right, but we needed to be at that place where we felt we were doing justice to what we learned from educators about knowledge. They called for knowledge, they called for resources, and they called for support. And this was our attempt to try and offer something back to educators to support them in this human rights endeavour, and particularly at this point in time where it's a time of assault, it's a time of far-right extremism, weaponization of transphobia, and we cannot be silent. We cannot, push things under the carpet. We have to be very, very, and we're hoping that the toolkit will be a scaffolding mechanism and a support for educators in schools to do the work that is important, especially at this time. So with this module, it ties into that notion of knowledge and key terms. Educators told us that they did have some understanding of some key terms, but they didn't always feel confident, actually, to take an understanding of those terms further, right? So in this module, we're introducing some key terms that are central to building an understanding of gender expansiveness beyond gender binary ways of thinking. And so the key terms are developed in this module in ways that we hope will help develop a deeper understanding of systems of oppression, that systemic oppression that Kenan was talking about, related to gender identity, which extends beyond just a narrow focus on transphobia. Trans-affirming education is not and cannot just be about addressing transphobia, even though that's a very important part of the education piece. So we introduce terms like cissexism. You'll see them in this module explained, cisgenderism, cisnormativity, but not only are they explained, there'll be links to accessible resources such as the cisgender privilege checklist, for example, at one point in the module. Other resources we found which we thought would be really useful for educators. One was produced by the Canadian Federation of Students, and it's entitled Challenging Cisnormativity, Working Toward Gender Inclusive Spaces. And it provides, I think, a really excellent starting point for identifying and understanding what cisnormativity is. So there's this emphasis on extending, building understanding beyond just a focus on addressing transphobia, but what are the sources of the transphobia, right? And it's these broader systems of cisnormativity, cisgenderism, cissexism. And another wonderful resource that I just want to leave you with that you might want to search out once you get access to the toolkit, which we're going to be providing the link at the end of the session, Jenny and Kenan, right? That's our aim.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So you'll get access. I just had an email from someone asking about that, but it will be accessible to you at the end. But this wonderful resource, and actually this was a resource that I discovered only recently, and so it was added, at a very late point. But it's called Nish Mandi Manid Uwag, and it's a translation of Two-Spirited Beings, and it features, and it's an accessible video that you'll be able to click on, and it features queer and two-spirit Indigenous youth sharing their experiences about their gender identities, and it provides insight into colonial systems and their impact on gender. But these people, these youth, are actually defying that system, and it's a wonderful video which actually presents Two-Spirit youth as, you know, really self-determining and active agents in, and so we thought that would be a really wonderful video and a wonderful resource. So I do look forward to anybody, once they start to look at these resources, to reach out to us and let us know your thoughts about them. So I hope that'll entice you to get in, you know, to read the module and to look specifically at some of the resources there that we've provided. And in fact, what I'm saying here about the way we've integrated resources, as Jenny says, that was the rationale throughout all the modules. There'll be integrative links integrated throughout, which you'll click on and will take you immediately to the resource. So the next module I'm just going to speak a little bit about as well before handing it over to Kenan and Jenny. This unit also builds on the first, but is very explicit in articulating an anti-oppressive approach, and in specifically how a trans studies informed framework, how we understood that is embedded within an anti-oppressive education approach. And at the heart of this approach is, I would argue, and which you'll see here, is a commitment to decolonisation and a focus on how gender oppression and gender entitlement are intertwined with other systems of oppression related to white privilege, ableism, classism. And what we do is introduce this intersectional framework, has an embedded framework within an anti-oppressive approach to education, which speaks specifically to trans-affirming education, and all the time bridging that with curriculum, right? So we're not just giving you an understanding of what our understanding is of those integrated frameworks, but all the time bridging to curriculum. There are sets of questions that we generated, and also throughout specific resources. And I'm just going to give you a little bit of a taste of some of those resources. For instance, there's a picture storybook, and it's called, let me see that I've got this right, Sylvia Riviera and Marsha P. Johnson Start a Revolution. And it's a resource that can be used in elementary school classrooms to educate about the role of these racialized trans women who played a significant role in fighting for the rights of queer and trans people in the Stonewall uprisings in 1969. It's a wonderful resource. And another resource is pitched at I think the senior school level, is a video called Screaming Queens, and it also documents riots that predate Stonewall, and it features trans women and drag queens who fought police harassment at Crompton's Cafe in San Francisco's Tenderloin District in 1966. Fantastic, really, video, and it ties in with this idea of the need to integrate into the curriculum education about trans history, about these amazing activists who fought for the human rights of trans and gender and diverse and queer people. So it's this point, I think, that we wanted to iterate in this module about educating about the other, for the other, which is a part of the anti-oppressive education framework, but more importantly, also at the same time educating about systems of power and privilege, systems of othering. Another resource is a pronoun resource. So there's a pronoun resource included. There's a resource for building gender and LGBT inclusive curriculum by Welcoming Schools. And that Welcoming Schools is an initiative of the Human Rights Campaign Foundation in the US, provides some wonderful hands-on resources that I think educators will find useful. And then there's a website that was really useful as well, called Gender Inclusive Biology, and it's a website dedicated to affirming gender and sexual diversity in the biology classroom. So they're just some of the resources that you'll find there. There's also a few other picture storybooks. The Boy and the Bindi is one of them, which is about a 5-year-old South Asian boy who becomes fascinated with his mother's bindi and who wishes to have one of his own. There's another picture storybook, 47,000 Beads, which is published by Flamingo Rampant, a local actually publishing company, which is fantastic. I encourage you to search out Flamingo Rampant. And this story is about Peyton, who loves to dance, and especially at powwow, but her auntie notices that she's been dancing less and less. And it's about the support that Peyton receives. And it's a wonderful, wonderful story. And I think this just proves, which speaks to Kenan's point and to the research, that this is age appropriate and in fact necessary to be addressing at the elementary school level and at the K to 12 level. So the resources throughout this module you'll see apply to K to 12. I'm going to stop there because I want to give Kenan and Jenny the opportunity to give you some further insight into the other modules that we developed. Thanks, everyone.
All right, so throughout our presentation so far, we talked a lot about this idea of systems that are in place that are often left unchallenged. And early on in our report, discussions about the report, as Wayne mentioned, it was a year, maybe longer process of questioning and discussions. And so among those discussions were this conversation around, we often hear trans-inclusive, trans-affirmative, and it's almost something that's done versus an active doing. And so we talked a lot about what the difference is between inclusive or affirmative versus something affirming. And so the term inclusive is commonly used to describe the school climate that we want to create. But a commitment to inclusion often translates into celebrating and representing diversity without necessarily addressing the roots of systemic oppression and specifically trans marginalization. So you think about things like Pink Shirt Day or any kind of like one-off day that celebrates a particular community without necessarily going further to do that work and address the system. So what we push for in this report and in this particular module is creating an affirming school climate, which tackles these root causes of systemic oppression. So it's about creating environments where certain identities are not seen as the norm or standard against which all others are compared. So when we talk about cissexism, cisnormativity, that's kind of what that is what we're getting at. So these environments lead to othering, which results in trans students being seen as exceptional, whereas an affirming approach sees all gender identities as equally valid and normal. So within our toolkit, we give some examples of what this looks like in practice. So we have a great chart that resembles this one here, inclusive versus affirming, in terms of pronoun usage or in terms of washroom access, what inclusive washroom access looks like versus affirming washroom access. And also trans-affirming approaches in curriculum. There's an inclusive approach and then there's an affirming approach that keeps in mind the systemic piece. So this approach is proactive in its acknowledgement of systems that marginalize trans and gender diverse folks. And it's actively, that word is key, confronting systemic barriers that otherwise go unquestioned, unconsidered, or unacknowledged. Even when one individual trans student seeks accommodation to fit within a cisgender normative system, the system remains in place. It's just these individualized accommodations that are actually being looked at. And so that's kind of how we're excavating the differences between those two in this particular module. And it gives you a lot of ways of thinking about what systemic pieces are in place and capacity and entry points to disrupt and try to turn things around a little bit through an affirming approach. Speaking to that accommodation piece, on a fundamental level, educators in Ontario are supported by human rights policy, specifically the Ontario Human Rights Code, which names specifically gender identity and gender expression as grounds for accommodation. So in this toolkit, we have a section devoted to policy and legislation, where we excavate some of the key policies, legislation that are in place. We look at what some boards are doing across the province that you can click on and look at. We give a detailed account of different PPMs that are in place that were put in place with the intention of supporting human rights and in some cases specifically gender. Beyond the provincial piece, provincial legislation piece, the Ontario Ministry of Education and also board level policy has embedded the expectations that educators are expected to accommodate trans and gender diverse youth. In many of these cases, as emerged in our report, educators would often signal, and this is tied to the accommodation piece, we don't have any visibly trans kids, and therefore they'd forego doing any proactive work to foster an affirming school. It's usually very reactive or waiting until a student is either introduced, assumptions are made about a student, or a student has to specifically out themselves for support that a trans inclusive policy is picked up and effectuated or an attempt is made. So much like the previous module, this one helps crystallize that you can't rely on the visible trans student to appear before doing the work. It's work that impacts the entire community. It's work that is first and foremost enshrined in legislation and policy at every level, but it's also work that can't simply stay at accommodation. That gets back to the inclusive piece and not the affirming piece, because that in effect doesn't confront or acknowledge the systems of harm that continue to put trans and gender diverse students at risk. And in actuality, to rely on this logic of accommodation results in the individual trans student having to advocate for themselves, which puts them at elevated risk, often outing themselves to seek out this accommodation, sometimes having to skirt around their parents, not knowing their identity and having to navigate that system on their own. And again, it leaves the system that puts them at risk completely intact in order to make them fit into a cis-normative system. And so here we excavate some of the policy and legislation that outline the expectations, but also the systemic responsibilities and how having this policy and legislation is important, but it's not necessarily enough to create that affirming school.
And so finally, what we have as our fifth module is 2 action plans, with the goal being to meet the reader where they're at in their own learning journey. So these are founded on a couple of principles. First, that concurrent systems of oppression can be challenged, that education and curiosity are some of our best tools to doing this, that representation of joy and thriving and flourishing trans communities has to be central to this work because these students deserve to see themselves in the future, that change is possible, and that we are stronger together in doing this work. Both of these action plans follow a similar progression. So we start with an inventory, an audit, a compilation, and a goal setting. So for the individual plan, what we're really looking at is the individual learning trajectory, focusing on personal beliefs, audits of prior learning, where our knowledge is coming from as a practitioner in a school. We're looking at an active compilation of resources to support our own learning and how we can begin integrating that into whatever practice we are doing within the school community. And finally, setting specific goals with timelines for ourselves to put this knowledge into action. For the school-based approach, this brings back the flexibility of the pick the module that you need, because you can start with a school-wide approach if that is what you would like. And when we're talking about school-based action plans, we're looking at the ways that we can work within our community. So maybe that is using this action plan with some colleagues. Maybe it's as a department that you're choosing to engage with it. What this does, or maybe you're feeling really, really ambitious and you decide that you're bringing the whole school community in on this. Maybe as a community, you decide that you each start with your individual action plans first and then move forward concurrently with the school-based plan so that there's some individual learning and reflection happening at the same time. The school-based approach is really looking at getting a better picture of the climate, because again, one of the things that we heard from our participants is, well, I think my school's pretty inclusive. But when we take a really frank look at what our knowledge of policy concretely is, when we look at what resources are actively being deployed in schools, when we take an audit of what the school climate is by talking to students, our perception of that safety and that sense of inclusion might shift a little bit, which then leads us to an active compiling of more resources that we can use and share and bring the school community along with. And again, having specific time-based goals for the community at large to make sure there's an accountability piece built in there. So these plans are frameworks that again address the needs that were shared with us by our participants, the need for education and resources, and then the support in translating knowledge into practice and action. But here with the action plans, we're making sure that there's space for those very specific and unique contexts, because every single school community across Ontario is so very unique. Our final thoughts, the toolkit ends with this. We had some time to put together some considerations to leave the reader with. And the first is that the responsibility to affirm trans identities is a job-embedded expectation of all staff who work in Ontario schools. This is for every single staff member. This is expected of us. That the inclusion of trans-affirming content is supported by policy at multiple levels. As Kenan was mentioning, it's at the human rights level. It is all over the Ministry of Education website that students have a right to see themselves represented in their schools, and that actually not seeing themselves represented is a direct return to their mental health. And that these representations have to be inclusive of age and subject matter. Affirming schools need to be a coordinated effort for everybody, and that we need to be doing this to ensure an intersectional approach so that equity issues aren't siloed off and broken off into specific days where or a month that we focus on a particular identity, and we recognize that these are enmeshed within each other. And we wanted to leave the readers with this quote from a participant from the study. The more I learn, the more I realize I need to learn. And for me, this is really a reflection on the continuous nature of the work of doing equity-based expansion within the schools. Our hope for this toolkit is that it is a starting point for the reader to facilitate and support discussions and the work that is already happening in Ontario schools, and maybe to support and facilitate the work that is just at its beginning stages, but that collectively we can bring more folks along with us as we work towards creating trans-affirming schools. Thank you so much for your attention as we talked you through this workshop or this toolkit. We would love to take any questions at this point that you might have. And we've got some Q&A set up on the Zoom. And if you've got questions in the audience, we do have a microphone. We're going to try this out. If not, I will repeat your question back into the microphone so that our folks on Zoom can hear. I do see one question in the Zoom.
I was gonna say, we'll Zoom Q&A maybe, just to keep it more organized, and you guys can filter through, like Wayne and Kenan.
Yeah.
And then I make sure this is it on?
Yep. So we have a question here from the Zoom Q&A. My team was wondering, what are the current policies on the rights of children to request name and or pronoun changes within the classroom without informing their parents? We have found that school boards are often silent and or will not allow for this without parental permission. And what would the most trans-affirming approach be to these requests by students? Thanks so much for this much needed resource. So I don't know the provincial piece. I know usually it's the school boards will have their own policies or procedures set out to support students in this mechanism. I do agree that often school boards are silent about this, but it should never require parental permission. It depends, I think, it also depends where your board is located. Oftentimes, you will find name requests and pronoun changes within either embedded in human rights policy or specifically the board's trans inclusive policy or gender identity policy. So it's, as far as I'm aware, it's more of a conversation with at the board level about what this inclusivity looks like in the policy piece.
Right now in Ontario, there is no legislation that says that parents must be made aware.
Yeah.
I know that this is happening across Canada and that this is coming into play, but right now, through the Ontario Human Rights Code, which takes precedent over everything else, students inclusive of age, so it doesn't matter if they're 3 or they're 30, are allowed to have their affirmed name and pronouns used in schools without having that information shared.
And I was just going to say that the right to privacy is very, very clearly articulated in the Ontario Human Rights Code. But we see where this is coming from, right? Like what's happening in New Brunswick, what's happening in Saskatchewan. There's this reverberating backlash and, comments were made by Ford recently about, about indoctrinating children. And so there's been, now in Alberta, there are discussions as well about moving to prevent the respect of human rights of trans kids in schools being able to use their self-assigned names and pronouns. But in Ontario, there is certainly those rights are protected under the code.
We did have a question.
So we are seeing that growing discourse, right, from parental rights groups to push back against that, not just in Ontario, but it's been a conversation also over in California, which is the most progressive state in the United States, about what are parental rights. And it's very clear, again, in legislation that parental rights is not an existent thing. It's not named, it's not real. And so it's really about the right of what's safest and healthiest for the student. And that is, as Wayne said, the privacy of discretion.
Mic check.
This is great because often I run the GSA at my school and it's often kind of just like, hey, you run the GSA, like, do you have resources for me? And I'm like, well, not always. So this is really tangible and something that, could be widely distributed. And I was just wondering if I wanted to present this as like a resource formally at a mandated staff meeting. Is there something that like a very condensed presentation that we would be able to do that? Because I'm assuming this is going to be widely circulated shortly. Yeah, I just didn't know if there was something that we could do also.
So we do not have anything formally set out as an accompanying piece to this toolkit. I'm going to go ahead and speak for the team right now, but you would be absolutely welcome to take the toolkit, pull out pieces that you would like to present to the mandated staff meeting attendees, because we know how much fun those all are. The other option is you can get in touch with us. We've got an email address that is dedicated to this, and we'd be happy to work with you to come up with something. I'm assuming, are you based in London? Yeah. Perfect. Yeah, we'd be able to work something out and make sure that you're supported in getting this information out. Yeah, you bet.
Yeah, hello, Kona. I want to ask a question. Can I go ahead?
Yep, your mic is live.
Yes. So my question is, I looked at the slides and you talked about lack of training and education on trans-affirming schools and transgender. So in what way is your project helping to provide training and resources for those people who are not familiar with the concept?
I don't know, Wayne, did you want to do that? I can answer that if you'd like.
Please go ahead, Jenny. I can add. anything, but
For sure. So the way that this toolkit is providing information is really through breaking down the different elements of what these words mean, the terminology, providing different points of access. So a number of different resources that are available that explain the terminology in different ways. If we're looking at gender identity specifically, one of the resources is the gender unicorn that is very widely taken up, but we've also included things like the gender galaxy, the gender wheel, that pull from different cultural understandings of what gender identity can be. So what we've tried to do in the toolkit is support the learning, understanding that everybody comes to this with different understandings and different knowledge bases that they are working from. And knowing that that is a very wide audience, providing as many different entry points as possible for the reader to find what it is that they're looking for.
yeah, I just wanted to add, fantastic, Jenny. Thanks for that. I also just wanted to add, you noticed that we were throwing words around like cissexism, cisgenderism, cis normativity. And so I was conscious that I was doing that and that we're all doing that in a way because they're explained in the toolkit, right? Like the term is used and there's key terminology that is explained, but we're also providing, as Jenny's mentioning there, those representations of the gender wheel and other sort of frameworks that visualize the difference between gender identity, sexual orientation, gender expression, and then explain that visually, but also there is terminology explained. And that's why that first module is sort of a platform and a scaffolded, in some ways, entry point into the other modules, even though it can be, you know, has Jenny and I think we conceived of the modules as being used independently, but, you know, the question you asked is addressed in that first module specifically. Can I just say there's a number of questions just coming up, Kenan, I don't know if you can see them as well, about the accessibility and access to the toolkit. So can we just sort of reiterate for everybody that the access, and they will be getting access, and how they can get access immediately to the digital online copy of.
And if you want to flip to the next slide, we can
get
that immediately.
Okay, great.
So you can go ahead and scan that QR code. I think Kenan is also sending that a link in. Oh, no, we don't have a chat. I lied. But you can scan this QR code. It's going to take you directly to our toolkit website. Just scroll all the way down. There will be a button that says download the report. Click on that and the toolkit is live.
And Jenny, there's a question that I think you'd want to take up here about, will this resource ever be made available in a multitude of languages with language-specific resources available? I'm thinking specifically of French. So I'm going to hand it over to you, Jenny.
Alors, si on a des francophones, je m'excuse, vous voulez vraiment faire ça en français aussi. But I'm the only francophone on this team, and I did not have the capacity to translate it. It is my hope that we are able to translate this toolkit, translate the report eventually with the support of people who have this very specific skill set and make it available. There are French resources in there. Again, if you are looking for specific language resources, I would encourage you to reach out to us, email us, because chances are that between the three of us, we've got something that you're looking for that might not have made it into the toolkit, because there are well over, I think, 150 resources in there, and we've got more on the back burner. So please do not hesitate to email us and ask. How are we feeling, folks? Do we have more questions? I don't see any more questions coming up in the chat.
Yeah.
Also, for folks who don't know how a QR code works, you just open your camera and point it at the QR code, and it should pop up on a yellow link. I know there are some folks around here who may not be able to do that without some instructions, so just
this is a point
laying it out there.
Hi, everybody. It's the other Jenny of the faculty. Wait, and if you can't see me, I don't think. I just have, first of all, thank you so much for this. I've enjoyed listening and just kind of taking it all in, and I agree with the tangibility of this, really, really necessary. So that brainchild to make this a toolkit, right? That we can take this otherwise esoteric research and put it into the hands of educators who are going to make the changes. I think that's super important. So my question is kind of practical, which is about the audience. You keep calling it the reader. Can the reader also be students? Like, in what ways are you thinking students in K-12 schools, at whatever age they're capable of engaging with this? I mean, you've got videos, you've got lots of resources at different levels. What do you think about, what are your thoughts about sort of putting it into their hands, having them have access? That's my one question. The other one is about the updating of the links. You said you have about 150 resources or whatever. These links, they sometimes get broken. So do you have plans to maintain those?
Okay, so I'll do the second question first. I am the plan for maintaining the links, and I will be checking them, probably not every week, but yearly I will go through and make sure that what we have is still relevant, accessible, and live, importantly. I think that your question about how students can engage with this is a really, really interesting one. One of the trends that I've noticed in working with youth is that, especially in education, there is a default to get youth engaged. But what that often translates into is the youth are going to do this work for the adults. And we see this in GSAs that get labeled as leadership clubs, where youth are put in a position where they are asked to educate administrators, where they are asked to educate their peers, where they carry a massive load and responsibility of making sure that the people in their space aren't harming them. What I would suggest is, before we start asking how can we get youth involved in this, is how can we get involved in this and prioritize adults taking charge of their own learning and their own activism and their own work to ensure that we are doing the work of making schools safer for students, not asking students to make the space safer for themselves. Is that okay? Kenan and Wayne, if you want to weigh in.
I just wanted to tell just a little story, if that's okay, about a trans student telling me that they were tired of having to educate staff in schools and their GSA because they didn't feel it was their responsibility to be producing lesson plans for teachers, and that's exactly what was happening. And so I just want to reiterate that point. But I do see the toolkit as a catalyst, right? Like some work's been done, and you know, it can be shared with students, and students could work very much so with educators leading that pedagogical commitment to supporting trans-affirming in education, where there's continuing consultation with trans and gender diverse students in the school. But it's an interesting question. It really got me thinking just about that story, how, you know, the student was really quite upset. And it's this idea that I think Kenan was speaking about this burden falling upon either an individual teacher, but in this case on the burden of the GSAs and the trans student themselves to do the work. But thanks for that question.
Another one back here.
We've got a question in the back.
I just wanted to make a comment. I'm so amazed by the work, and I wanted to say that as researchers and educators, you try to capture what your impact would be. And this is impact. This is more than any article will do. This will change lives, it'll change schools, it'll change experiences, it'll change families. And so I just wanted to congratulate the three of you on this enormous accomplishment, creating this toolkit, and just to say this is impact. When we look at our own work, it's sometimes hard to imagine where the impact is. And it's always a stretch when you think of a written article of this is impact. So congratulations.
Thank you so much, Donna. That means a lot.
Yeah, I think there's one more question in the Q&A.
One more question?
We have another question in the Q&A, and this is from Sarah, who asks, what can be done regarding parents opting out of any gender and sexuality training? Parentheses, I'm thinking specifically grade 7 health, but if we are doing trans-affirming approach at all grades, I'm wondering about potential pushback from many families. You spoke about quite a bit on the Canadian laws, etc. Is this information also in the toolkit? So I think we're in an interesting juncture right now where we're seeing more of these calls to opt out from parents' rights groups. And in many cases, and I know specifically in some of my own personal experiences where these students don't even necessarily want to be pulled from the lessons. It's the parents who are serving as kind of moral arbiters about this. And with the updated 2019 sex education curriculum for grades 1 to 8, there is a provision that school boards have to give parents, I think, 20 school days of notice about sexual health lessons. And then they have to fill out an opt-out form and blah, blah, blah for their child participating in the class. As in terms of what can be done, I would always encourage conversations, if possible, with parents about, there's a lot of myth about what these lessons include. Certainly, I've heard it in my own board about, well, they're doing sex reassignment surgery in classrooms, which is, I would be concerned if that were happening too, right? Like that's not the case. And there's a lot of myth that's being spread through X, formerly known as Twitter, or Reddit, or whatever, about what these lessons entail. So a good starting point is being able to have these conversations with parents about what the intention of the lesson is, why it's important, not just for their student to be a part of it, but for all students to hear about it, how it links to human rights expectations and how it links to policy expectations about supporting students. So to me, a lot of that pushback can be addressed through these more nuanced conversations and doing that work. Part of the affirming approach is doing the work. And again, not just one educator having to do that work or offloading it onto one educator to do that work. It should be an integrated, continued approach to dispelling those myths. I don't know, Wayne or Jenny, you want to add to that?
I just wanted to make a distinction between, I think it's helpful to distinguish the health PE sex education curriculum from an integrated approach to addressing gender and sexual diversity, but in this specific case, gender diversity across the curriculum. And, you know, so if I think about an English teacher integrating novel, which includes a trans character or a non-binary character, you know, is a parent going to then ask their child to be removed from that classroom? I think that, you know, I think that what I wanted to say, though, is that I would say that I don't think it's acceptable. And I think that you can't just withdraw someone on the basis of, you know, addressing gender diversity because, you know, I mean, it's a nonsense. But within the health and sex ed curriculum, I think there's always been a caveat or an accommodation there. Am I right? Because sex education historically has always induced moral panic, always. And, you know, we had a case of it here with, you know, the revised curriculum, health PE curriculum, sex ed curriculum in Ontario. And I don't have to tell educators in the room about that. And then Ford government was elected, and then they rescinded that progressive curriculum and required everybody to return to the 1998 version of it. But within the context of that sort of backlash, you know, there were discussions, educators were talking about, well, you know, does that mean I can't address gender diversity within, you know, the English classroom in other areas of the curriculum? So I think that it has to be framed as, you know, all youth need to see themselves represented in the curriculum. Baseline, all human rights, the human rights of all students need to be represented and addressed, right? So, and I see a distinction between, I don't think there is a requirement or an option for It's something I will investigate though, and maybe we can look at it. You know, I want to look at that more closely, but as I understand it, you can't just withdraw a student from another area of the curriculum. I don't think that applies.
So I can speak a little bit more to that. And so the folks who are in my class, I'm sorry, you're going to hear this again, but this speaks to the importance of knowing the policy that we're working with. And there are very clear procedures for requesting an accommodation on whatever basis to be removed from the health and physical education. This is only K-8, it doesn't apply to high school. And every single board is going to have procedures put in place. But if you don't know that those procedures exist and you aren't familiar with what that process looks like, then if somebody comes to you and says, I'm yoinking my student from your classroom, you're going to say, okay, I guess, because I don't know any different. And I don't know who to ask at my board about whether or not this is what we're supposed to be doing. So the familiarity and the fluency with policy is critical to understanding what our roles and responsibilities are as educational workers within a school. The second part of that is that the health and physical education is the only one that you can request to be removed from. This does not apply to your day-to-day procedures or lessons at all. In fact, one of the very first lines in the Education Act says that the purpose of education is to create caring citizens. And we cannot do that if we're not learning about folks with identities that we don't hold. And so this is embedded, again, it's a job embedded expectation that every single student see themselves represented, and that students who don't hold that identity or who are not part of those communities also learn about them, because that is what helps us create safer spaces for students.